Grammar Girl here. I'm Mignon Fogarty, your friendly guide to the English language. Today, we're going to talk about schnauzers, scallywags, and the phrase used to. But first, I have a correction from the recent show about how dog breeds got their names. I said schnauzers are a type of terrier, and their name means growler in German. But a listener named Priscilla, who breeds schnauzers, wrote in to say that schnauzer actually means mustache, which makes sense if you've ever looked at a schnauzer with their cute little faces. And since Priscilla is essentially a schnauzer expert, I figured she probably knew what she was talking about. But at first, I was confused because I double-checked my source, and the online etymology dictionary, which I've always found to be reliable, does say that schnauzer first showed up in English in 1923, and that the word comes from German schnauzer, which literally means growler, coming from schnauzen, which means to snarl or growl, which comes from schnauz, meaning snout or muzzle. Plus, the American Kennel Club website also says the breed name comes from schnauz, meaning snout or muzzle, going back to that same origin, but leaving out the seemingly middle step related to snarling or growling. But then I checked Google Translate, and it told me that schnauzer in German does indeed mean mustache. So what is going on? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary finally pieced it together for me. It also says the dog name comes from German Schnauzer. That was a name for the dog going back to at least 1767, and that it did mean snout. But then it also has a note that says, quote, with the use to denote a breed of dog, perhaps compare also to German Schnauzer mustache, unquote. So it seems that a lot of people think schnauzer comes from a German word for snout or muzzle, and that maybe there's an intermediate growling meaning, but that the word can also mean mustache in German. At this point, I'm not sure anyone really knows the ultimate origin of the name, but it does all go back to their distinctive snout area in some way. And finally, one more fix while we're here. Priscilla says that only miniature schnauzers are in the terrier group. Standard schnauzers and giant schnauzers are working group dogs. They don't go to ground like the earth dog terriers. Thank you, Priscilla, for that helpful note. Next, in honor of Talk Like a Pirate Day, which is coming up September 19th, I want to tell you about the origin of the word scallywag, because, believe it or not, it's related to Shetland ponies. First, although I think of scallywag as a pirate term, it actually isn't, or at least it wasn't, in the golden age of pirates from the 1650s to the 1730s, when Blackbeard, Henry Morgan, and Captain Kidd terrorized the seas. Scallywag is actually an Americanism that only became a word in 1839, according to Etymonline, which makes it more like roughneck and loon, which are words that emerged as American colloquialisms around the same time. A roughneck was a rowdy troublemaker, and a loon was someone who was a lunatic, foolish, unintelligent, irrational, or out of touch. That word comes from the ancient idea that people who aren't mentally well are under the influence of the moon, or the moon's phases. It's the same root that gives us the word lunar for things that are related to the moon, as in the lunar landing. But a scallywag is a good-for-nothing, a man who won't work, according to the OED. But here's the fun part. Although the origin is ultimately unknown, one story is that it goes back to the group of Shetland Islands in Scotland, which is also where Shetland ponies originated. Apparently, people were keeping small workhorses there as far back as the Bronze Age. The Scottish people called rustic farm servants scallags after Scalloway, which is one of those Shetland islands. Scallag might have been combined with wag, meaning a habitual joker, to give us scallywag to refer to a bad person. But it's a little confusing because another early use was to describe a scrawny, worthless animal and could just come from the place name Scalloway. But either way, presumably Scottish immigrants brought the word to America where it was first recorded to mean a bad guy. Then, for a period during the U.S. Civil War and after, a scallywag was a specific kind of bad guy in the Confederacy. They used it as a derogatory term for white Southerners who supported Reconstruction. But never fear, you can still have fun with this word on Talk Like a Pirate Day, because despite its non-pirating origins, scallywag does appear in many modern pirate stories. You'll find it in Pirates of the Caribbean, where Jack Sparrow talks about keeping the scallywags at bay. And a quick search of Google Books turns up a bunch of pirate-themed children's books, such as Scallywag on the Salish Sea, Princess Scallywag and the No Good Pirates, and the Scallywags of Nobody's Island. Did you ever used to wonder when you're supposed to use used to with a D or used to without it? Maybe you're just used to not really knowing. Well, let's see if we can clear things up so that from now on, you'll know which form should be used to make which types of meanings in which types of sentence constructions. On the surface, there seems to be a clear division between used to and used to. Used to in the past tense is used to mean accustomed to, or to refer to something that existed or habitually took place in the past but no longer applies. For example, if I say, I drive in traffic every day, so I'm used to it, I'm using used to mean accustomed to. And if I say, I used to drive in traffic a lot, but now I don't have to, I'm meaning used to mean formerly. We can even use used to in both senses in a single sentence. For example, I used to hate driving in traffic, but now I'm used to it. Use to in the present tense is for when we're using the verb use in its primary sense, meaning to utilize or employ, as in, what can I use to get stains out of white clothes? So where does the confusion come in? Well, for one, when we're using the verb use to mean utilize, we might need to use it in its participle form to make a passive construction. For example, to answer the question about stain removal, I might say bleach can be used to get stains out. That's passive voice because I'm not saying who's actively using the bleach, but just indicating, in passing, that bleach could be used by someone. So that's a case of used to with the ed ending, being used to mean utilized, not accustomed to or former. Another reason the forms are easily confused is that although they look different in writing, they're basically pronounced the same way in everyday conversation. We have a natural tendency when we talk to want to alternate consonants and vowels, which is one of the reasons why babies' first words are often things like mama, dada, and baba for bottle. Each word is a series of consonant, vowel. Our tongues just don't like having to pronounce too many consonants in a row. So it's hard to pronounce the final D in used when it's right next to the T in to, and we whittle it down to used to, making it easier on our mouths but a little harder on listeners, because now past tense used to sounds like it's in the present tense. And it's even harder on writers because when we hear and say used to with no final D for used to, we tend to want to write it that way. And so we write, I'm not used to driving in traffic, when we really should be writing used to with a D. And there's a third wrinkle. What if I want to ask whether someone formerly did something, or I want to deny that I did? Well, technically, in these cases, in questions and negation, used to with a D should be transformed into used to with no past tense ending. For example, if I'm asking about your driving habits in the past, I should say, did you used to drive in traffic a lot? Not did you used to. And similarly, I'm supposed to say, I didn't used to drive in traffic, not I didn't used to. It's not uncommon for people to keep the D on used in cases like these, and some sources suggest that it may now be somewhat acceptable to do so. There's something about did you used to that sounds funny to our ears. It's also possible that we keep the D on used even when we're not supposed to because we're a little nervous about mixing up used to and used to. and the fully pronounced used to form with a D sounds more correct, even though it's not. So why does the D in used to disappear in questions and negatives? Well, it may seem illogical, but it parallels what we do with most other past tense verbs. In English, but seemingly few other languages, when we form questions and negatives, we add an extra word to the sentence, a form of do. For example, we don't say, drove you home last night, but instead, did you drive home? And we don't reply with, no, I drove not, but with, no, I didn't drive. Notice what happens to drove, the past tense form, when we add did. It turns into drive, present tense, even though we're still talking about the past. So where'd the tense marker go? It's now on did, the past tense of do. If we said, did you drove home last night, we'd be double marking the past, and we don't need to. So it's did you drive. The same thing happens with used to. It turns into used to when it's used with did. Did you use to do it? No, I didn't used to. Interestingly, before the 15th century, it was perfectly acceptable in English to say and write things like, drove you the oxen, and I drove them not. But then, for some reason, people started forming questions and negatives with do and did, a phenomenon historical linguists called do support. After a long period when it was optional whether you formed your questions and negatives the old-fashioned way or with do, the do and did forms eventually won out. That happened in the 18th or 19th century. There was even a brief time, somewhere around Shakespeare's era, where you could add an extra do to affirmative sentences, as in, I do drive, or I did once drive. We have a similar thing today where we add do for emphasis, but back then, you could add it with no additional meaning. Do was just a popular word. Which reminds me, if you add did for emphasis with used to, that's another case where you need to drop the D. Yes, I did use to love driving. Used to, not used to. In short, in English, while we used to be able to talk about and deny things without using do support, we're now used to do and did. In fact, a form of do must be used to form questions and negatives, and we can't forget to move the tense marking from the main verb to do. You might be tempted to say, did you used to drive? Or I didn't used to go. But to be technically grammatically correct, you need to use use. This may sound strange, but you're just going to have to get used to it. That segment was written by Natalie Schilling, a professor emeritus of linguistics at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and who runs a forensic linguistics consulting firm. You can find her on LinkedIn. Finally, I have a Familect story from Mimi.
Hey, this is Mimi. I have a funny one. So my niece was in a wedding, and, you know, nerves can run high, and you've got the bridal breakfast, and you've got the rehearsal dinner and all the family inner workings. And somebody was relating later that the bride and her sister had a big screaming argument at the bridal breakfast. And the friend was trying to just sink into the woodwork and not be noticed. And she said, I was just eating my cheese grits. So whenever something happens where you just wish you could fade into the woodwork and nobody noticed you, that's what we say. We say, I was just eating my cheese grits.
Thanks, Mimi. That's funny. If you want to share the story of your Familect, a word or phrase that you only use with your friends or family, leave a message on the voicemail line at 833-214-GIRL or leave a voice message on WhatsApp. Be sure to call from a nice, quiet place, and if you want that number or link later, you can always find them in the show notes. Grammar Girl is a quick and dirty tips podcast. Thanks to Dan Feierabend in audio, Morgan Christianson in advertising, Holly Hutchings, director of podcasts, Rebekah Sebastian in marketing, and Nat Hoops in marketing, who thinks ADHD is his biggest superpower. And I'm Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl and author of the tip-a-day book, The Grammar Daily. That's all. Thanks for listening.